A sealed envelope can end a man's empire just as quietly as a bullet. In the marbled corridors of the Aldgate Hotel, where Chicago's most powerful men came to close deals they'd deny under oath, the person who knew every secret wasn't a lawyer or a spy. She was the woman behind the accounting desk on the mezzanine level, the one nobody bothered to look at twice. Eloise Farrow had worked in hospitality finance for 11 years. Before that, she'd spent 3 years at a mid-size accounting firm in Indianapolis. Chasing a CPA license she eventually got, but never quite believed in. She was 31 years old, 5'4", and built in a way that made expensive hotel uniforms require special tailoring, broad through the hips, full in the chest, with a softness to her frame that men in this world interpreted as harmlessness. She wore her dark hair pulled back tight. She kept her voice low. She learned early that in rooms full of powerful men, a woman like her could exist in a state of near-perfect invisibility, and she had spent the better part of a decade deciding whether that was a curse or a gift. She had decided, quietly and without fanfare, that it was the sharpest weapon she'd ever been handed. The Aldgate wasn't just a hotel. It was a clearinghouse. Business was conducted in the second-floor lounge over single malt scotch and charcuterie boards, in whispered conversations between men who believed the ambient piano music rendered them inaudible. Eloise processed their invoices, reconciled their accounts, and occasionally, when the night shift left her alone at her terminal, cross-referenced the numbers with things she'd overheard that didn't quite add up. She never did anything with the information. She filed it in the back of her mind the way a librarian files a book, carefully by subject, in case anyone ever needed to find it. On a raw Thursday evening in late February, the Aldgate was running at capacity. A private dinner had been arranged in the Harrington suite on the 14th floor. A reservation that had come through 3 shell entities before landing on the hotel's booking system under the innocuous name of Meridian Capital Partners. Every senior staff member knew what that name meant. It meant Dorian Cross was in the building. Dorian Cross, 42 years old. Publicly, the chairman of Cross Maritime Holdings, a logistics and shipping conglomerate with ports from Lake Michigan to the Gulf Coast. Privately, the man who had restructured the distribution networks of half the organized crime operations in the Midwest after the old families fractured in the mid-2000s. He didn't run a crime family in the traditional sense. He ran infrastructure. He was the reason contraband moved efficiently and money moved quietly, and the men who relied on that infrastructure paid him accordingly, in loyalty, in silence, and in very large wire transfers that Eloise had once accidentally glimpsed on a routing ledger that passed across her desk before it was swiftly recalled. She had said nothing. She had memorized every figure. Dorian Cross was not a man people described with ordinary adjectives. He was tall and lean in the way of men who have never stopped being physically dangerous, despite acquiring enough wealth to hire danger out. His hair had gone silver early, which on him looked less like aging and more like authority made visible. He spoke in complete, measured sentences, never raised his voice, and had a reputation for knowing when someone was lying to him before they'd finished the sentence. 3 times in the past 8 years, business partners who had attempted to deceive him had simply ceased to appear at the kinds of events where men like Dorian Cross appeared. Nobody talked about it. That was the point. Eloise had seen him in the lobby twice before. Both times, he had not looked at her. Both times, she had looked at him very carefully. The Thursday dinner in the Harrington suite was meant to be a quiet affair. 6 attendees. Private catering arranged through the hotel kitchen, no outside staff. Eloise knew this because she had signed off on the catering surcharge. What she hadn't known, until she crossed paths with the suite's assigned server near the service elevator at 7:45, was that the server, a young man named Benji, who had a tendency to text while walking, had twisted his ankle on the back stairwell. The catering supervisor, a brittle and perpetually exhausted woman named Greta, found Eloise in the mezzanine office 17 minutes before the first course was meant to be served. "I need someone in the Harrington right now, and I don't have anyone." Greta said it with the flat urgency of a woman who had run out of capacity for panic. "You've covered service before." "I know you have. I'm an accountant," Eloise said. "You have a food handler's certificate on file, and you've filled in for the lounge twice. I've checked." Greta was already holding a pressed server's jacket. "It's 1 dinner, 3 courses. You stay quiet, you pour, you clear. You're not interacting with these guests." Eloise looked at the jacket. She thought about the name Meridian Capital Partners. She took the jacket. The Harrington Suite was the hotel's largest private dining room. Cream paneling, a long walnut table that seated 12, chandeliers that cast everything in a flattering amber. When Eloise entered with the amuse-bouche cart at 8 o'clock exactly, 6 men were already seated. She assessed them in the time it took to close the door behind her. 2 she recognized as regular Aldgate guests. Older, local money. The kind who sat on museum boards and also on the boards of companies that did business in ways that didn't appear in their annual reports. 1 was younger, mid-30s, with the specific restlessness of a man waiting for something to happen. 1 was heavyset and florid, a glass of bourbon already half empty in front of him. 1 she didn't recognize at all. Grey suit, unremarkable, the deliberate blandness of a man who had cultivated invisibility as professionally as she had. And at the head of the table, hands flat on the walnut surface, was Dorian Cross. He was speaking in a low tone to the man at his right when Eloise entered, and he did not look up. She moved around the table with practiced efficiency, placing each small plate without sound. She was large enough that navigating the narrow space between chairs and credenza required a particular sideways economy of motion she had long since perfected. Nobody acknowledged her. The conversation continued as if she were a piece of the furniture, which was exactly why she heard everything. The man in the grey suit, the unremarkable one, was named Aldrin Fosse. She caught the name from the man in the florid face, who addressed him once and then apparently thought better of it. Aldrin Fosse was speaking very little, which Eloise noted because the men who spoke very little in rooms like this were rarely doing so out of shyness. They were listening. They were tracking. They were doing what she was doing, except with a purpose she suspected she would not approve of. It was during the second course that she saw it. Foss had placed his phone face down on the table to his left when he sat. Sometime during the fish course, the phone lit up briefly against the tablecloth, and Foss moved his hand to cover it, a gesture so practiced and fluid it would have been invisible to anyone watching his face. Eloise was not watching his face. She had been watching his hands for the past 20 minutes, because his hands were the only part of him that betrayed the controlled tension running through the rest of his body. She caught 2 words on the screen in the half-second before his palm covered it. Team ready. Eloise set down the wine bottle she was holding. She turned back toward the credenza, her broad back to the table. Her pulse had gone very quiet in the way it did when her brain was moving faster than her body. She scanned the room again, this time not as a server, but as herself. The younger, restless man. He'd stopped checking his watch. He was watching the door. The florid man with the bourbon had barely touched the second drink he'd poured. His eyes kept moving to Foss, and Foss himself. The grey, unremarkable man had shifted his chair by precisely 3 inches since she'd last placed it mentally. He was no longer squared to the table. He was angled toward Dorian Cross. Eloise had read enough crime history in the long, quiet evenings of her apartment, because she was a woman who lived alone and found true crime preferable to reality television, to recognize the choreography of what she was looking at. 1 man with a phone receiving confirmation, 2 associates positioned as passive anchors, a single primary target who did not know he was a target. Dorian Cross, the man who could read a lie before it was finished, was sitting at the head of the table, completely unaware that the man 2 seats to his left had just received a ready signal. Eloise picked up the wine bottle again. She moved to refill the glass of the man nearest the credenza, buying herself time. Her mind ran the calculation with the same cold efficiency she applied to balance sheets. She could walk out. She could find Greta and say nothing. And whatever happened in the Harrington suite would happen, and she would return to her mezzanine office and continue being invisible. She thought about the way Dorian Cross had, once, in the elevator lobby, held the door open for a cleaning woman, struggling with a supply cart. He hadn't looked at the cleaning woman the way most guests looked at hotel staff, through them, past them, at the middle distance of their own priorities. He'd looked directly at her, held the door, and said, "After you." It was a small thing. It was the kind of thing that revealed the actual composition of a person far more reliably than anything they said at a dinner table. Eloise made her decision. She moved to the credenza, keeping her back to the table. Her hands were steady. She was a woman who had spent 11 years keeping her hands steady in rooms that made other people nervous. She pulled a small notepad from the inner pocket of the server's jacket, Benji's notepad, which she'd found in the pocket when she put it on, and she uncapped the pen clipped beside it. She wrote 4 lines. Her handwriting was small and precise, the handwriting of someone accustomed to fitting important information into tight spaces. Foss, phone signal, team ready, 9:04 p.m. The man to your left and the heavy man across are waiting on him. Exit route, do not use the main corridor. She tore the page free, folded it twice into a tight square the size of a sugar packet. She slipped it into the breast pocket of her jacket. The 3rd course was a beef tenderloin with truffle demi-glace. Eloise pushed the cart from the service alcove with the same unhurried competence she'd used for the previous 2 courses. She worked the right side of the table first, placing each plate from the left in the correct sequence. When she reached Dorian Cross, she set his plate with her right hand and, with her left, lifted his water glass to refill it from the pitcher on the cart. The notepad square was pressed between her index finger and the base of the glass. As she set the glass back down, she let it rest for half a second longer than necessary. And in that half second, she met his eyes. Dorian Cross had dark eyes, almost black, with the particular quality of attention that made a person feel they were being read at a cellular level. He had been mid-sentence to the man on his right. He stopped. Eloise did not smile. She did not nod. She held his gaze for exactly 2 seconds. Long enough to be deliberate, short enough to be deniable. And then, she moved the glass precisely 1 inch toward his right hand, leaving the folded square on the tablecloth beside it, half covered by the base of his water glass. She moved on to the next place setting without pause. Her heart was throwing itself against her ribs with considerable force, but her face was the same composed neutral it always was, the face of a woman no one was watching. From the far end of the credenza, she heard the faint, cotton-soft sound of paper unfolding under a tablecloth. She did not look. She counted her own heartbeats instead. At heartbeat 11, the temperature in the room changed. It wasn't anything visible. It was a shift in the molecular quality of the air. The kind of change that only registered in the nervous systems of people who had spent years reading rooms. Dorian Cross had finished reading what she'd written. And Dorian Cross, whatever else he was someone who processed information without losing his face. He reached for his water glass. He took a measured sip. He set it down and resumed his sentence to the man on his right as if he'd merely paused to swallow. But his left hand, now resting on the tablecloth, was 2 inches closer to the inside of his jacket than it had been before. Eloise had moved to the service alcove. She gripped the edge of the cart and breathed. What happened in the next 4 minutes was more faster and more controlled than anything she had prepared herself for. Dorian Cross stood, ostensibly to pour his own drink from the decanter at the table's center, a gesture unusual enough that every man in the room tracked it. In rising, he moved his chair, which placed him no longer at the head of the table, but at its side, with the solid oak credenza behind him and a clear sightline to the door. He said something to the florid man. She couldn't catch the words, only the tone, which was conversational and easy, the tone of a man who was not alarmed. The florid man responded. Foss's eyes moved to Cross and stayed there. Cross turned his head and looked directly at Fosse. "Aldrin," he said pleasantly, "I have to be honest with you. I've been trying to figure out who you work for since the soup course. I'm almost certain now. Do you want to tell me, or would you prefer I just ask your associates outside?" The quality of silence that followed was absolute. Fosse's hand moved toward his jacket. Cross was faster, not dramatically, not with any of the theatrical speed of the movies, but with the compact, economical efficiency of a man who had never outsourced his own survival to other people. He caught Fosse's wrist mid-motion, pivoted, and had the man face down against the walnut table before the restless younger man had fully risen from his chair. "Sit down, Owen," Cross said to the younger man without raising his voice. Owen sat. In the same breath, Cross had his phone in his hand. 3 words spoken into it. Harrington. Now. Yes. Within 90 seconds, 2 men in hotel-branded attire that failed to conceal the particular posture of trained security entered through the service door. Not the main entrance, Eloise noted. The service door. He'd read her note carefully. Foss and his associates were removed. The older guests, to their considerable credit, remained seated and continued their dinner with the disciplined composure of men who had witnessed worse and understood the value of pretending otherwise. Dorian Cross straightened his jacket. He turned toward the service alcove. Eloise was still standing at her cart. She had not moved. She looked at him the way she'd looked at him when she'd slid him the note. Directly, without performance, without the trained deference that 11 years of hospitality had made second nature. He studied her for a moment. His expression was difficult to read, not because it was blank, but because it was processing something he hadn't anticipated. "You work here," he said. It was not a question. "Accounting," she said. "Mezzanine office. I was covering for someone tonight." "What's your name?" "Eloise Farrow." He nodded once, slowly. "How long ago did you see the phone?" 9:04. "Second course. And you waited until the third?" "I needed to be certain. And I needed a reason to approach you that wouldn't alert the other 2. Cross looked at her for another long moment. Something moved behind his eyes. Not warmth exactly. Not yet. But the specific quality of attention a person gave to something that had rearranged their understanding of a situation. "You're an accountant," he said. "With a food handler's certificate," she said. "Apparently." The corner of his mouth moved, barely. "Go back to your office, Miss Farrow. Don't speak to anyone tonight about what you saw in this room. Someone will be in touch." Eloise returned her cart to the service kitchen. She went back to the mezzanine office. She sat at her desk and stared at the spreadsheet she'd left open, and she did not close it for a very long time, because staring at numbers was the only way she knew to keep her hands from shaking. For 2 days, nothing happened. She went to work. She reconciled invoices. She ate her lunch at her desk and avoided eye contact with Greta, who seemed to want to ask questions that Eloise had no intention of answering. She kept waiting for something. She didn't know what. A knock at her apartment door. A black car on her street. She had no framework for the thing she had stepped into. Because the things she'd read in true crime books were not particularly reassuring about the outcomes for civilians who interfered in organized crime operations. On the evening of the second day, she was walking to the L stop on Wabash when a town car pulled to the curb beside her. Not an SUV, not a fleet vehicle. A clean, dark grey sedan with a driver who did not speak, only inclined his head toward the open rear door. Eloise got in. She told herself afterward that it was a rational choice, because irrationality in that moment would have looked like running, and there was nowhere to run to that she couldn't be found. But the truth which she admitted to herself in the leather interior of the sedan, was that she got in because some part of her had been waiting to see what came next. They drove north and then east, ending at a glass and steel high-rise on the lakefront. Not a hotel, a residence, the kind of building with a private elevator bank and no visible doorman, only a discreet security panel. The driver escorted her to the 32nd floor without speaking. He knocked on a door and stepped aside. Dorian Cross opened it himself. He was not in a suit. He wore dark slacks and a simple charcoal shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbow, and he looked, improbably, like a man who had recently been tired and had not yet stopped being tired. The apartment behind him was large and severely clean. Floor-to-ceiling windows facing the lake, minimal furniture, a kitchen that looked like it was rarely used, and a dining table covered in files that clearly was. "Come in," he said, and stood back. Eloise came in. "Drink?" he asked, moving to a cabinet near the window. "If you're having one," she said. "I am." He poured 2 glasses of bourbon, not a question of preference, a decision. He handed her one and gestured toward the table, moving a stack of folders to make space. They sat across from each other, the way 2 people sat when neither of them defaulted to small talk. "I had you checked out," he said. "I assumed you would." Elores Ann Farrow. 31, Bachelor's in Finance from Purdue, CPA certification. 11 years in hospitality accounting, the last 4 at the Aldgate. He paused. "Remarkably clean record given the environment you work in." "I see a lot," she said carefully. "I've never done anything with it until Thursday. Until Thursday." He turned his glass in his hands, a slow quarter rotation. "Why?" Eloise had thought about how to answer this question for 2 days. She'd drafted several versions in her head, measured, sensible, each one technically accurate. She discarded them all. "Because Foss reminded me of every man who has ever looked right through me," she said. He thought he was safe, because the person in the room who saw everything was someone nobody would bother to watch. She looked at her glass. "I've spent 11 years making myself easy to ignore. I know exactly what it looks like when someone else is doing it for a reason." He wasn't invisible. He was hiding. Cross was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice had dropped half a register. "The 2 men I pay specifically to read a room," he said, "didn't see what you saw. They were watching the door and the windows," she said. "You watch for the weapon. You should watch for the hands." Cross studied her with an expression she couldn't name. It was too complex to be simple admiration and too direct to be calculation. It sat somewhere in between, in the territory of a man encountering something that had shifted the way he understood a problem he thought he had solved. "Foss was a plant," he said, "enrated into my operation 4 months ago through a legitimate business channel. The men outside the suite were freelance, contracted through an intermediary. The orchestration was clean." He paused. "My people are still tracing the source. Your description of the phone signal gave us a timestamp that aligned with a location ping we'd otherwise have missed." Eloise absorbed this. "Who wanted you removed?" He looked at her. It was the look of a man deciding how much truth to give a person. "Someone who has been operating in the space I operate in," he said, "for long enough that they've stopped believing in consequences." She nodded once. She understood that was all she was going to get, and she accepted it. "I want to offer you a position," Cross said. He said it simply, without preamble, the way a man announced a conclusion he'd already reached and was not particularly interested in debating. Eloise looked at him. "Doing what?" "What you were doing Thursday night. Watching, reading the room, attending meetings that require someone who can identify the Aldrin Fosses before they receive a ready signal." He leaned forward slightly. "I have lawyers, I have security, I have accountants who are very good at their job and entirely blind to what happens between the numbers. What I don't have is someone who understands that the most dangerous person in a room is usually the one everyone has decided to ignore." Eloise said nothing for a moment. She was running the calculation. The same cold, clear-eyed efficiency she brought to every ledger. What does the position entail, specifically? You would travel with me, attend dinners, negotiations, events. You would be listed as a financial consultant on the cross-maritime payroll, which you would also actually be. Your accounting background is useful in other contexts. He paused. You would not be asked to do anything you find unconscionable. You would be asked to tell me the truth about what you see. And if I see something that concerns me, she said carefully, in your operation, a beat, then you tell me that too. It was not the answer she'd expected. She'd expected a deflection, a qualification, a smooth pivot around the question. Instead, he had met it directly, with the particular steadiness of a man who meant what he said. What do I earn? She asked. He told her. The number made her set down her bourbon glass. She picked it up again. She took a drink. She looked at the lake through the floor-to-ceiling glass, 32 stories above the city, where she had spent 4 years being the most observant person in every room and the least acknowledged. When would I start? She asked. Monday, he said. There's a shipping arbitration in Milwaukee. I want you in the room. She nodded. I'll need to give 2 weeks' notice at the Old Gate. You have 2 weeks. Then Monday after next, she said. Something shifted in Cross's posture. Not much, just a fractional release of tension across the shoulders. The kind of thing she would only have caught because she had spent 2 days memorizing the precise architecture of his self-possession. Monday after next, he agreed. She finished her bourbon. She set the glass on his file-covered table. She stood, and he stood, and they shook hands with a formality that was not cold, but simply honest. The agreement of 2 people who were both too direct to bother performing a warmth they hadn't yet earned. He walked her to the door. At the threshold, she paused, because there was one more thing she needed to say. Foss, she said. He was hiding in plain sight because he thought plain sight was safe. You should tell your people to stop looking for threats where threats are supposed to be. They won't come from there. Cross looked at her. In the low light of the hallway, his expression was something she would spend considerable time afterward attempting to precisely categorize, a mixture of respect and a recognition that looked almost like relief. I know, he said. That's why I need you. The next 14 months were a study in recalibration. Cross Maritime's senior staff received Eloise with the polite skepticism reserved for people who appear in powerful men's orbits without an obvious explanation. She was introduced as a financial consultant, which she was, and which gave her a reason to be in every room without requiring further justification. She carried a tablet. She kept notes. She wore suits that she'd had tailored in the first week, because she had learned long ago that the difference between invisible and overlooked was largely a function of whether you had decided to take up your own space. She began methodically to take up her space. In the first month, she flagged a discrepancy in a Port Authority contract. That turned out to be the entry point for a surveillance operation targeting Cross Maritime's Lake Michigan shipping lanes. The attorney on the account had missed it in 3 reviews. Eloise found it in 40 minutes. In the second month, she attended a negotiation with a Boston logistics firm and told Cross afterward that the firm's lead negotiator, a polished man named Whitmore, was showing every micro-expression of a man who had already agreed to terms with someone else before entering the room. Cross pulled out of the deal. 3 weeks later, the Boston firm announced a merger with a direct competitor, the terms of which would have made the contract with Cross Maritime legally untenable. By the 5th month, the skepticism of Cross's inner circle had curdled into something more complicated. Not quite respect, not quite wariness, but the particular kind of attention people gave to someone who had been correct too many times to dismiss. She noticed other things too. She noticed that Dorian Cross kept a photograph on his desk that he never referenced and never moved. A younger version of himself, with a woman whose resemblance made it clear she was a sister. and whose absence from his present life was evident in the way he never mentioned family, ever under any circumstances. She noticed that he ate the same breakfast every morning: black coffee, 2 eggs, wheat toast, wheat. With the regularity of a man who had simplified everything that could be simplified in order to preserve his capacity for the things that couldn't, she noticed that he was rigidly courteous to every person below him, in any hierarchy, not performatively, not in the calculated way of a man cultivating an image, but with a consistency that suggested it was simply how he had decided to be. She noticed, with increasing clarity, that he noticed things about her too. He knew how she took her coffee without asking, after 3 mornings. He adjusted the temperature of whatever room they were working in. She ran cold, a fact she'd never mentioned, without comment. At a dinner in Detroit, a man at the adjacent table made a comment about her appearance under his breath. The kind of quiet cruelty that men in those rooms assumed was inaudible to everyone but each other. She had heard it. She had said nothing, as she had said nothing to similar comments for 11 years. Cross, who had also heard it, said something to the man in a voice so low she caught none of the words, only the tone, only the way the man's color changed, and he did not speak again for the remainder of the evening. Cross didn't tell her about it. He returned to their table and resumed the conversation as if nothing had interrupted it. She thought about it for a long time. It was during a late working session in the spring. The Milwaukee arbitration had metastasized into a full legal dispute that required 12-hour days and considerable quantities of bad conference room coffee, that the professional membrane finally became something else. They had been working at opposite ends of the same table for 6 hours. The legal team had left an hour prior. The room was quiet in the particular way that rooms became quiet at 11 at night, when 2 people were the only things still running. Eloise reached across the table for a contract summary and knocked her coffee cup, which was empty, toward the edge. Cross caught it without looking up, his hand moving with the automatic reflex of a person who had catalogued the position of every object within arm's reach of him since sitting down. He set the cup upright and slid it back toward her side of the table. "You do that constantly," he said, still reading. "Knock things over? Know where everything is?" He looked up. "You've been tracking the room for 6 hours. You've been tracking me." Eloise considered denying it. She didn't. "It's a habit," she said. "I pay attention to things that move." He set his document down. He looked at her with the same unguarded directness he brought to everything, the quality that had initially unnerved her, and that she had, slowly, and without quite intending to, come to find disarmingly trustworthy. "Eloise," he said, "what do you see when you look at me?" The question landed with the weight of something that had been accumulating for a long time and had finally found a place to settle. She looked at him steadily, a man who has been alone for a long time and has become so accustomed to it that he stopped recognizing it as a condition. Something shifted in his face, not defensively, simply recognized. "And what do I see?" he said quietly. "When I look at you," she didn't answer. She waited. "Someone," he said, "who has made herself so small for so long that she's forgotten she doesn't have to be. Who is the most exceptional person in any room she walks into and has spent 11 years perfecting the art of making sure no one notices." He paused. "I notice." The silence between them was not empty. It was the most occupied silence she had ever sat inside. Cross stood and walked around the table, not quickly, giving her every opportunity to redirect, to stand, to change the subject. She did none of those things. He stopped at the end of her chair and looked down at her, and she looked up at him, and the distance between them was the specific distance that requires a decision to close. "I am not an easy man to be near," he said. It wasn't a warning exactly. It was information offered with the same honesty he brought to everything. "I'm not a simple woman," she said. "We can be difficult together." His hand came up to her face, tilting her chin with a gentleness that sat strangely and beautifully against everything else she knew about him. He kissed her with the measured, absolute certainty of a man who had decided something and saw no reason to be tentative about it. And she let herself be kissed without flinching away from it, without making herself smaller, without any of the instincts she'd spent 31 years cultivating to protect a woman no one was looking at. She was done not being looked at. The Cross Maritime Annual Stakeholders Summit was held in June at the Aldgate Hotel, a choice that Dorian Cross made, and that Eloise understood immediately to be deliberate. 240 attendees. Investors, port authority officials, logistics partners, and exactly the kind of men who would once have looked through the mezzanine accounting office window without registering what was behind the glass. Eloise came in at 8:30 with Dorian Cross, and the room's collective attention landed on her with a physical weight she felt in her sternum. She was wearing a deep burgundy suit that had been made for her body, not approximated for it, with the precise cut that made a person look not despite their size, but with it, like every inch was exactly where it was supposed to be. Her hair was down. She had not made herself smaller. She had not arranged her face into the conciliatory neutrality that had been her default expression for 11 years. She was watching the room, and the room, for the first time, knew it. There were whispers. She caught fragments, some curious, some cautious, all of them adjusting. A shipping partner from Houston said something to his associate and nodded at her with an expression that had recalibrated from dismissal to calculation. She filed him away. A Chicago alderman who had met her twice in her accounting role blinked at her across the room with the specific blankness of a man struggling to reconcile two entirely different files in his head. Cross kept his hand at the small of her back as they moved through the room, not possessively, not as display, but as simply and consistently as a man indicating to the world the alignment of his priorities. He introduced her to everyone he spoke with, not as a consultant, as Eloise, just her name, said with a weight that told every room they entered that her name was the only credential she required. Near the close of the reception, the Houston partner approached them. He offered Cross his hand and then, after a beat, offered his hand to Eloise. "I have to ask," he said, with the hedged frankness of a man who was accustomed to asking anything he wanted. "What exactly is your role here, Miss Farrow?" Eloise smiled. Not the trained hospitality smile, the reflexive, professional deflection, but her actual smile, which was small and did not invite further inquiry. "I watch," she said simply. "I pay attention to what other people miss." The Houston man looked at her for a moment. Something crossed his face, the specific reconfiguration of a man who had misread a room and was only now understanding the cost of that mistake. "I see," he said. "No," she replied pleasantly. "That's actually the whole point." She had spent 11 years learning to disappear. She had spent 14 months learning that the woman who had disappeared was more formidable than anyone in any room had prepared themselves to reckon with. The Aldgate's marble floors, the same ones she had walked for 4 years carrying a badge that said accounting and a silence that said, "Don't notice me," now held her footsteps differently. Or perhaps she was simply no longer asking them not to. The woman who had made herself invisible was done apologizing for the space she took up. And every person in that room, looking at her now, understood without being told that seeing her clearly, finally, fully, for everything she was not something they were going to get a second chance at getting wrong.